This presentation is on IEP essentials, in particular, data-based present level of academic achievement and functional performance statements, and ambitious, achievable annual goals. Within this past decade, a significant change occurred to federal legislation. Under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, it used to be the case that a hearing officer or court would determine whether a student's IEP was reasonably calculated to enable a student to receive educational benefit using a de minimis test under Part 2 of Rowley. In May of 2017, the Supreme Court elevated the test in the Andrew versus Douglas County School District case, and now the Rowley/Andrew test requires a hearing officer or court to determine whether a student's IEP was reasonably calculated to enable the student to make progress appropriate in light of their circumstances. One way that the hearing officer or court would look to see the reasonable calculations in an individualized education plan would be to look at the present level of academic achievement and functional performance statements to see whether the IEP team is addressing or failing to address all of the students' disability-related needs, to see whether the IEP team is addressing all of the students' behavioral support needs in the IEP and behavior intervention plan. Failing to address all of the students' academic or behavioral needs in the IEP could signal that the student is not being provided a free, appropriate public education in the least restrictive environment. This could be found to be a violation of the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. So we as IEP team members, as special education teachers, need to take care to write data-based present level of academic achievement and functional performance, or PLAAFP statements, to write measurable annual goals, to specify level of attainment so that we can measure and document the child's progress toward their ambitious, achievable, meaningful, measurable goal, and provide services linked to disability-related needs that connect to measurable IEP goals. Any failure therein might mean that we are not educating the student in the least restrictive environment appropriate to their unique needs. Be compliant and to stay student-centered, culturally, linguistically responsive, let's look at some key components of an IEP. The present level of academic achievement and functional performance is a section of the IEP where we describe prerequisite skills and knowledge that the student needs in order to accelerate progress from their present level toward the grade level content standard. We use data to summarize the present level. Now, the grade level content standard should be the grade level of enrollment. So if the child is a 10th grade student with an intellectual disability who's following an alternate curriculum, we would still look at 10th grade standards using the extended standards or alternative curriculum under the DLM, Dynamic Learning Maps Essential Elements. Here's an example of a PLAAFP statement for a student, Roger, whose disability-related need shows that he needs to improve his skills for blending and segmenting multisyllabic words so that he can fluently read grade-level text in order to comprehend written material. Data from standardized measures of reading achievement, the NWEA map, show that Roger consistently scores below the 10th percentile. His map scores are commensurate with about 10% of same-age test takers. According to his performance on curriculum-based measures using grade 2 probes, Roger reads aloud at a slow pace, making miscues with single-syllable words that use long vowel patterns. He is accurate in decoding regularly patterned consonant, vowel, consonant words in isolation and in connected text. Roger achieves an average rate of 28 words correct per minute, which is below his target score of 113 words correct per minute. He reports that he uses the skip it strategy when he comes to a word he does not know and states that he does not like reading. These statements corroborate the general education teacher's observations and anecdotal records that document Roger's difficulty with reading and determining meaning from multisyllabic words that appear in 4th grade level text. So the PLAAFP statement, if we look at that example, should have a minimum of 5 to 7 data-based sentences that allow the interpretation of what the student is doing now in an area of educational need. The data should be derived from multiple sources: records review, interview, observation, testing, RIOT, RIOT, records, interview, observation, testing. And the data should be collected at multiple points in time, for example, weekly progress monitoring scores, review of anecdotal records logged over the past month, observation in different settings. Read and rate David's PLAAFP, keeping in mind that we want 5 to 7 data-based sentences that tell what the student's doing now, that use records, interview, observation, testing at multiple points in time. David adds, subtracts, multiplies, and divides numbers written as fractions or decimals with 85% accuracy. He learns best when using manipulatives. He has difficulty applying basic computational skills using fractions or decimals in real-life situations. From David's PLAAFP, do you have a picture of what his current performance level is? Do we have a picture of his current performance level distilled by records interview that tells his perception, that tells other general education teacher or family perception, observations that show performance over time, and testing that might include standardized results? I don't see all of those components addressed in David's PLAAFP statement, so while it's a good start, it would need substantive revision in order to comply if it were to be subject to the Rowley-Andrew test in a hearing. Read and rate J's PLAAFP. WJ 3 scores. Reading 5.0, written language 3.4. J's reading continues to improve, writing needs work. So we know we're after 5 to 7 data-based statements. I don't see complete statements here. I do see some data. However, there is no context to interpret what 5.0 means. Is reading 5.0 the grade equivalent, age equivalent? How should we interpret that given whatever J's current age or grade is? Likewise, with written language 3.4, we don't know how to interpret that as a age equivalent, grade equivalent. Maybe that is a scaled score on the test version that's listed here, WJ3, which presumably would be Woodcock-Johnson 3rd edition, a much older edition of the Woodcock-Johnson. J's reading continues to improve is vague. It doesn't give us a picture of what he's currently doing, improving from what to what. Writing needs work, similarly vague. Needs work because it's looking like what right now? How do we know what an indicator of improvement would be to show that the work would be paying off for Jay? Read and rate Matthew's PLAAFP statements. Matthew has difficulty with imitating peers. He does so in a negative way, using attention-seeking behaviors too frequently, and doesn't employ social skills to given situations. So we do have some complete thoughts in these statements. All of the information being shared comes from observation. However, it lacks objectivity. Subjective statements like does so in a negative way and too frequently don't have any data to give context or conditions so that we can interpret the frequency, intensity, duration with more objectivity. Doesn't employ appropriate social skills. What would be the definition of appropriate? Who gets to decide? Is this in every situation? What is the given situation? Could that be fleshed out more? So Matthew's PLAAFP would also need significant revisions in order to confer free appropriate public education in the least restrictive environment in a way that doesn't risk violating the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. Read and rate Timothy's PLAAFP. To promote academic success, Timothy should receive visual considerations. This single sentence doesn't give helpful information for an IEP team to get a picture of what Timothy can currently do so that they can calibrate an expectation for an ambitious, achievable IEP goal. It's not clear what a visual consideration is. What does that mean to consider? Does he need visual aids, visual supports? If so, could those be described? And should that really be alone a PLAAFP statement? There's no clarity in which area of academic success is benefiting from the visual support, so we don't have enough information to really interpret anything about Timothy's academic achievement or functional performance, which is the purpose of the PLAAFP statement. Read and rate Susan's PLAAFP. Susan has autism. She needs practice with numbers and fine motor skills. A sentence like that, Susan has autism, is very rarely written in the IEP document. Usually you find in the eligibility paperwork the designation of the eligibility determination, but providing that sentence followed with what she needs practice in doesn't function as a PLAAFP. It doesn't tell us anything about academic achievement or functional performance. This would be like initial brainstorming kind of thinking that the team would need to turn into a PLAAFP statement by conducting a records review, interviewing the student, general education teacher family, observing student Susan across multiple settings, and giving tests, both formal, informal, standardized, curriculum-based, to develop a more composite profile of Susan's academic achievement and/or functional performance. Read and rate Sam's PLAAFP. Sam writes simple sentences, e.g., who is doing what, correctly with no more than one error in 5 sentences. When writing paragraphs, he includes topic sentences but does not organize ideas in logical sequence. He doesn't write compound or complex sentences consistently or independently. We have a pretty substantial picture of Sam's current performance or current academic achievement in writing. This could be strengthened even further by adding some test information, adding a bit of history through records review so that we can have the context of how his performance has changed over time, over settings, across different supports. So this is a pretty decent start and could be enhanced by adding more sentences that have more data from the RIOT, records, interview, observation, testing sources. The PLAAFP is sort of the engine that drives the IEP goals. So IEP goals are directed at why, or the root cause that the student is not meeting grade level expectations. They should address student-specific needs that will improve their access, engagement, and progress toward on-grade level standards and expectations across environments, settings, curriculum. And the IEP goal should be measurable, ambitious, and achievable. The U.S. Department of Education reminded us in a Dear Colleague letter over 10 years ago now, that IEP goals must be aligned with the academic content standard for the grade level in which the student is enrolled. An IEP that focuses on ensuring a student is involved in the general education curriculum will be aligned with academic content standards at the grade level of enrollment. So let's say there's a fourth grade student with a learning disability who's really struggling in reading foundations and doing just single syllable short vowel word reading, where fourth graders typically are already past single syllable word reading multi-syllabic words and more complex text. Well, we would need to align that IEP goal with a fourth grade reading foundation standard because the student is in fourth grade, and not be tempted to go back down into kindergarten standards because that would violate providing a free, appropriate public education in the least restrictive environment. For students with the most significant cognitive disabilities, intellectual disability, traumatic brain injury, educational autism, think of like level 3 or really complex support needs, the goals are aligned with alternate academic standards and aligned with the grade level content standards. So when we develop the measurable annual goals, we think of the alignment where the present level statement gives us the baseline. We set a level of attainment from a year out, the date that that IEP is being developed, and we establish procedures for measuring progress and monitoring performance to ensure that the child is making progress toward attaining the IEP goal. The goal statement should tell who, the time frame, the conditions, the behavior, and the criterion. For setting the level of attainment for an IEP goal, we have a lot of options for what we want the child to be able to accomplish in a year's time in terms of how they're performing in a particular skill area or how they're achieving, demonstrating competence or proficiency with a particular academic, behavioral, functional skill. The IEP goal should have a criterion that matches and makes sense for the skill in focus given the context of what is stated in the present level. So things that might work for setting a criterion could be setting a percentage accuracy. It doesn't always have to be 80% accuracy. It might make sense for the child to go from 70% accuracy to 90% accuracy, depending on how complex the skill is. It might make sense for them to go from 0% to 20% instead of 80% in a year. So it has to make sense to fit the skill and to be aligned with the present level data. Another way of setting a level of attainment could be a frequency count, like 0 times per day or 2 times per class period. We might set a criterion that says in 8 out of 10 opportunities or in 8 out of 10 observations for 8 out of 10 responses. We might even have the criterion be something like with independence or with no pausing for a possible duration, like for 5 minutes, they'll engage and sustain in whatever the skill or behavior is. Maybe we want a combination of 100% accuracy or 100% success for so many consecutive days or trials. Finally, we could set a criterion that's with a certain number of prompts per class period. So there are many options other than simply leaning on 80% accuracy as the criterion for an IEP goal. Let's take a look at how the disability-related need could align with the content of an IEP goal. So if we've got a child who's working on improving reading comprehension, we would set an IEP goal that gives us something measurable, meaningful, ambitious, and achievable. I'm looking at option B. Given a passage at an instructional level, the student will answer inference questions and identify the main idea with 90% accuracy on 5 consecutive weekly quizzes. So improving reading comprehension matches that IEP goal because answering inferential questions is a way to show comprehension. If the child needs to work on phonology and decoding, I might look at a goal like a given 4th grade level text, the child will read 100 words correctly per minute in 90% of trials. So that word reading accuracy could be an indicator of improvements in phonology. For the need to develop new strategies to reduce frustration so the student can engage with peers during unstructured activities, I might use a goal like C. After reviewing a social story and role-playing, the student will complete lunch at table with peers and play with at least one peer for at least 15 minutes, 3 out of 5 days per week without adult assistance. Evaluate your goals using the checklist on the screen and note that the verbs that you use to name skills should represent observable actions, things that you can see, hear, count, repeat. Verbs like write, list, name, state work better than verbs like understand, interpret, because we can see and collect evidence of somebody writing. We can hear and count what somebody is listing. We can see a label being placed, but we really can't see what it looks like for a student to understand. That verb is too ambiguous. So here's an example of a goal. Using the order of operations, Robbie will be able to accurately simplify 2 out of 3 numerical expressions on quizzes and tests by the end of the IEP term. Evaluate that goal using the indicators on the checklist. Now try another one. Evaluate the goal by the end of the IEP term. Juliet will use a variety of strategies, context clues, word study, morphology, to identify the meanings of unknown words in provided texts with 80% accuracy in 4 out of 5 trials. So evaluate that goal, focusing on the skill in question. Is it something that we can see, hear, count, repeat so that we can document level of attainment? Are we able to notice whether Juliet is identifying meaning of unknown words? What would we be looking for there? Would it be maybe more precise to say, state the definition, match the word to its definition, select the definition from context clues on a multiple choice task? So the way that the goal is written, if we evaluate it using the checklist, it should be possible for every member of the IEP team to read the goal and walk away with the same interpretation of how they're going to know whether that child is performing a skill or demonstrating functional performance to the degree specified so that everybody could have consensus on whether the level of attainment is met. If the goal is written with ambiguity, the team won't have a way to make consistent, accurate interpretation, and an individual implementer of that IEP goal might be vulnerable or subject to make errors in their progress monitoring because maybe the interpretation they use in quarter 1 somehow changes in quarter 2 and they've stretched a little bit what the intended meaning of that goal was. So we want to be precise and operational with the way that we write IEP goals so that they can be meaningful, measurable, but also ambitious and achievable.